Most people believe Biltmore was built as a celebration, a monument to excess, a billionaire's fantasy carved into the mountains of North Carolina. That belief is comforting, and it is wrong. Because in the year 1895, when construction on Biltmore was reaching its most ambitious phase, the United States looked invincible on the surface and deeply unstable underneath. Railroads stretched across the continent. Steel fortunes multiplied overnight. Cities expanded faster than law, faster than trust, faster than social cohesion. Newspapers called it progress. Financiers called it destiny. Politicians called it inevitable. But the people who controlled the money did not behave like men who believed the future was safe. They behaved like men preparing for rupture. George Washington Vanderbilt II did not build Biltmore near New York. He did not place it beside markets, ports, or power centers. He chose distance, elevation, isolation. That choice alone should make us uncomfortable. Because when the richest family in America turns its back on America's centers of power, it is not an aesthetic decision. It is a calculation. The illusion we inherit today is that the Gilded Age elite believed in permanence, that they trusted the system that enriched them, that they built palaces to display confidence. But confidence does not require contingency planning. Confidence does not require thousands of acres, private infrastructure, and geographic separation from social pressure. Biltmore was not designed to impress strangers. It was designed to remove dependency. And dependency, in the late 19th century, was becoming dangerous. By the early 1890s, America was already showing fractures that polite history tends to smooth over. The Panic of 1893 had wiped out banks, destroyed railroads, and thrown millions out of work. Armed labor conflicts erupted in Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Colorado. Federal troops were deployed not against foreign enemies, but against American workers. Newspapers reported strikes. The elite read something else between the lines. Resentment. Wealth had concentrated faster than legitimacy could keep up. The Vanderbilt fortune, built on railroads that stitched the country together, had also helped produce the very conditions now threatening stability. Rail monopolies dictated prices. Farmers drowned in debt. Urban workers lived one accident away from starvation. The distance between those at the top and those below was no longer abstract. It was visible, and visibility creates pressure. This is where the myth of Biltmore begins to crack. Because if Biltmore were only a palace, it would have followed the logic of visibility. It would have stood near social circuits, near political leverage, near elite gatherings. Instead, it stood apart, quiet, self-contained, hidden behind forests, hills, and acreage so vast it functioned as a buffer zone. Isolation is not romantic. Isolation is defensive. Every design decision at Biltmore reflects this psychology, not overtly, not dramatically, but consistently. The estate was not merely large, it was operational. It could generate power, it controlled water, it managed food production at scale. It trained foresters decades before conservation became fashionable. These were not indulgences, they were redundancies. Redundancy is what you build when you do not trust systems to hold. What makes this unsettling is timing. The 1890s were still spoken of as an age of optimism. The American frontier had only recently been declared closed. Industrial output was exploding. Immigration surged. The country spoke the language of ascent. And yet, beneath that rhetoric, elite families were quietly hardening themselves against volatility. The popular image of old money imagines arrogance. What the architecture reveals instead is anxiety. Biltmore's scale suggests excess, but excess alone does not explain land acquisition patterns. Tens of thousands of acres were consolidated, not for display, but for control. Control of access, control of resources, control of distance between the household and external chaos. This is where a deeper question emerges, one rarely asked out loud. What did the Vanderbilts believe was coming? They had lived through financial panics. They had watched populist movements threaten property rights. They had seen anti-monopoly rhetoric gain traction. They had observed how quickly public opinion could turn hostile when inequality became undeniable. Wealth had made them powerful, but it had also made them visible targets, and visibility is dangerous in times of stress. Biltmore's location, far from major cities, reduced exposure. Its design reduced reliance. Its staffing structure ensured order. Nothing about this was accidental. The house appears extravagant, but extravagance does not usually prioritize resilience. Biltmore did. Even the aesthetics serve a dual function. Grandeur signals legitimacy, upward status among peers, while distance shields downward from collective anger. This is how elite survival strategies often operate, not through walls and guards alone, but through separation so complete that conflict never reaches the doorstep. There is a common assumption that wealth protects by accumulation. History suggests it often protects by withdrawal, and this is the uncomfortable inversion most tours never mention. Biltmore was not built because America was strong. It was built because America was unpredictable. The Vanderbilt family had benefited enormously from national expansion, but expansion always carries its opposite. Systems grow faster than rules. Fortunes outpace consent. At some point, pressure seeks release. The late 19th century was approaching that threshold, and the people with the most to lose could feel it first. We tend to believe collapse announces itself with explosions and declarations. In reality, collapse begins as recalibration, as hedging, as quiet adjustments by those who understand risk earliest. Biltmore was one of those adjustments. This reframing matters because it changes how we read power. If the most powerful Americans of the era did not trust the future, then confidence was a public performance, not a private belief. The optimism sold to the masses was not the optimism practiced by the elite. That gap between what is said and what is built is where truth usually hides. George Vanderbilt was not a revolutionary. He was not an alarmist. He did not publish warnings. He simply acted as if stability was temporary. He invested in permanence, not growth, in land, not leverage, in systems that could operate independently. If the larger system failed to cooperate, that mindset is older than America itself. European aristocracies had long understood that regimes change faster than estates. Laws shift, taxes rise, crowds turn. What survives is not popularity, but preparation. The uncomfortable implication is that Biltmore belongs less to American optimism and more to European memory. Memory of revolutions, memory of confiscations, memory of how quickly admiration transforms into hostility when inequality hardens, and inequality was hardening. By the time Biltmore was completed in 1895, the country had already crossed several invisible lines. Wealth was no longer admired unconditionally. The word plutocrat entered common use. Political movements openly questioned inheritance. Journalists exposed industrial abuses. Trust in institutions eroded, even as institutions grew larger. This is why the idea of Biltmore as a party house collapses under scrutiny. Party houses invite attention. Biltmore absorbed it, diffused it, neutralized it with scale and distance. Visitors came, but always on the estate's terms. Access was controlled. Movement was managed. The environment itself enforced order. Order is not a concern of celebration. It is a concern of survival. And yet, here is the paradox that makes this story linger. Biltmore looks permanent. It feels solid. It suggests endurance. But permanence is always an illusion, constructed under pressure. The very fact that Biltmore still stands invites a dangerous misunderstanding. Survival does not mean success. Endurance does not mean intention fulfilled. Structures can outlive their purpose while losing their power. What matters is not that Biltmore survived. It is why it was built to. Because once you accept that Biltmore was not an indulgence but a hedge, the story stops being about a mansion and starts being about a mindset. A mindset that assumes systems fail, that wealth attracts hostility, that safety must be engineered quietly before it is needed. And that raises a question that refuses to stay in the past. If this is how America's richest family behaved at the height of American confidence, what does that say about the moments when confidence begins to crack? And more importantly, who, today, is building their own version of Biltmore without saying so. If Part 1 dismantled the illusion, Part 2 exposes the machinery. Because once you stop seeing Biltmore as a house, you begin to see it as something else entirely, a controlled environment designed to reduce exposure to the outside world at a moment when the outside world was becoming volatile. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for modern audiences, because the logic behind Biltmore is not antiquated. It is cold, rational, and still in use today. In the late 19th century, most wealthy Americans lived close to the systems that enriched them: cities, financial centers, ports, rail hubs. Proximity meant influence. Influence meant leverage. That model worked as long as the system itself remained trusted. But the 1890s were already demonstrating how quickly trust could evaporate. The Panic of 1893 did not simply destroy capital. It exposed fragility. Railroads failed, banks closed their doors, cities filled with unemployed men who had nothing left to lose. The federal government, still limited in its ability to respond, relied on force rather than relief. This was not a distant abstraction to families like the Vanderbilts. Their wealth was tied directly to railroads, the very arteries now collapsing. So the question was no longer how to grow wealth faster. It was how to survive instability longer. Biltmore answers that question in its layout, not its ornamentation. Start with geography. Asheville, North Carolina, in the late 19th century, was not a cultural capital. It was not politically central. It was not economically dominant. What it offered instead was distance, physical and psychological. Distance from labor concentrations. Distance from organized political agitation. Distance from the kinds of crowds that had already proven capable of shutting down entire industries. This was not accidental taste. It was risk distribution. Then consider scale. Biltmore was not merely large. It was surrounded by tens of thousands of acres under single ownership. That acreage functioned as insulation, a buffer between the household and the external world. The land absorbed shock before it reached the core. Land is slow. Land does not riot. Land does not strike. That understanding shaped elite behavior long before America existed. European aristocracies learned, often violently, that urban wealth invites confrontation, while rural control diffuses it. Biltmore follows that older logic far more closely than it follows the mythology of American frontier optimism. Inside the estate, the same logic repeats. Electricity generation was not outsourced. Water systems were not dependent on municipal control. Food production was not symbolic. It was planned. Dairy operations, farms, greenhouses, and storage facilities turned the estate into a semi-autonomous organism. This is the detail most casual histories miss. Autonomy is expensive, inefficient, and unnecessary unless you believe dependency is a liability. Luxury maximizes pleasure. Autonomy maximizes survival. Biltmore invested heavily in the second while disguising it as the first. Even the workforce structure reflects this thinking. Thousands of workers lived and labored within a tightly managed environment. Housing, wages, schedules, and behavior were regulated. This was not generosity, it was predictability. Predictability is the currency of stability. When unrest spreads, unpredictability is what elites fear most. Not poverty itself, but the loss of control over variables. Biltmore reduced variables. It internalized them: food, labor, power, water, each brought inside the perimeter, where it could be monitored and managed. This is not the language of celebration. It is the language of systems engineering. And systems engineering emerges when risk becomes systemic. By the late 19th century, elite Americans were increasingly aware that political risk was no longer hypothetical. The progressive movement was gaining momentum. Antitrust sentiment was growing. The idea that immense inherited fortunes were illegitimate was no longer fringe. It appeared in speeches, newspapers, and legislation. The wealthy could no longer assume protection through prestige alone, so they adapted not through speeches, but through architecture. Biltmore's design reflects a worldview that assumes external systems may fail turn hostile, or become unreliable. That assumption changes everything. It explains why efficiency mattered less than redundancy, why cost mattered less than control, why beauty coexisted with infrastructure. The estate's forestry program, for example, was not a hobby. It was among the earliest large-scale scientific forestry efforts in the United States. Timber management ensured long-term material supply. Soil conservation protected agricultural productivity. Sustainability, in this context, was not environmental idealism. It was continuity planning. Continuity planning is what institutions do when they anticipate disruption. And the disruptions of the era were not subtle. Violent strikes erupted across industries. The Homestead Strike of 1892 had ended with bloodshed. The Pullman Strike of 1894 had paralyzed rail traffic nationwide and required federal intervention. These were not distant headlines for the Vanderbilt family. They were existential threats to the very networks that produced their fortune. Railroads were no longer neutral infrastructure. They were battlegrounds. When infrastructure becomes contested, elites seek alternatives. Biltmore was one such alternative, not a replacement for rail wealth, but a hedge against its volatility. It represented a form of capital that could not be shut down by strike, seized overnight by regulation, or disrupted by urban unrest. Land endures where markets fluctuate. What makes this even more revealing is what Biltmore did not emphasize. It was not built as a fortress. No walls bristling with weapons. No overt militarization. That would have signaled fear too clearly. Instead, the defense was subtle, geographic, logistical, psychological. The estate discouraged confrontation by making access difficult. Distance alone filtered who could arrive. Roads, terrain, and scale worked together to limit spontaneity. Nothing about Biltmore invited mass presence. This is a recurring elite strategy. Never provoke resistance directly. Instead, make resistance impractical. From the outside, Biltmore appeared open, cultured, refined. From the inside, it was controlled, monitored, and resilient. That duality is not hypocrisy. It is design, and it reveals a deeper truth about power. Power rarely announces its fears. It embeds them. The most important features of Biltmore were not decorative. They were structural, and structures reflect expectations about the future. You do not build for scenarios you consider impossible. You build for the risks you believe are likely. So when historians describe Biltmore as an indulgence, they miss the question that matters most. Indulgence against what? Against boredom? Hardly. Against vulnerability? Much more plausible. The Vanderbilt family had already seen how quickly public sentiment could turn against concentrated wealth. They understood that legal protections are not static, that taxation, regulation, and public hostility can converge, that no fortune remains untouchable indefinitely. Biltmore represents an attempt to slow that convergence, not to stop it forever, just to create distance. Distance buys time, and time is often all elites need. What makes this unsettling is how recognizable the pattern is today. When contemporary elites build private infrastructure, secure compounds, self-contained systems, and parallel institutions, they often justify it as efficiency or lifestyle preference. But the underlying logic has not changed since the 19th century. Reduce dependency, control variables, prepare quietly. Biltmore's grandeur distracts from its intent. Visitors marvel at ceilings and tapestries while missing the more important lesson. Power does not trust permanence, even when it benefits from it. And this brings us to the most counterintuitive realization of all. Biltmore was not built because the Vanderbilts believed America would collapse tomorrow. It was built because they believed America could change in ways that made their position less secure. Collapse, for elites, does not always mean chaos. It can mean taxation, regulation, redistribution, loss of deference, the erosion of legitimacy. Those changes do not require revolution. They only require time. So Biltmore was a long game, a structure designed to outlast moods, policies, and social tides. Not forever, just long enough But every system carries a cost, and systems built to protect power often transfer risk downward. Which raises the next question, the one the architecture cannot answer on its own. If Biltmore was a survival system, who was absorbed into it? Who maintained it? And who became dependent on it to survive themselves? Because no system protects one group without exposing another. And that is where the story becomes harder to admire. By the time Biltmore's systems were fully operational, the illusion of serenity depended on a population that never appeared in the photographs. The estate did not function through architecture alone. It functioned through people, thousands of them, whose lives were quietly reorganized around the survival logic of a single household. This is the layer the grandeur was designed to obscure. Because systems built for elite resilience do not eliminate risk. They relocate it. Biltmore required an enormous human infrastructure to maintain its autonomy. Farmers, foresters, dairy workers, domestic staff, craftsmen, engineers, guards, drivers, cooks, seamstresses, and clerks formed a private labor ecosystem embedded entirely within the estate's boundaries. Many lived on Vanderbilt land, many relied on Vanderbilt wages. Many had no realistic alternative source of income within reach. Dependency was not incidental. It was structural. From the outside, Biltmore appeared as an enlightened experiment, modern management, scientific forestry, orderly villages. From the inside, it functioned like a closed circuit. Employment, housing, and access were linked. Stability was offered, but it came at the price of autonomy. This arrangement created a peculiar asymmetry. The Vanderbilt family pursued independence from society. The workforce became more dependent on the estate than ever. This is not cruelty in the cinematic sense. There were no whips, no spectacle. The control was quieter, bureaucratic, and therefore more durable. Schedules were enforced. Behavior was monitored. Social life bent around work requirements. The estate became the primary axis of existence. In times of abundance, such systems appear benevolent. In times of stress, they reveal their true function. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were not stable decades for labor. Wages fluctuated, injuries were common, safety nets were minimal. Outside the estate, workers faced strikes, unemployment, and urban crowding. Inside the estate, predictability replaced freedom. Predictability is seductive when alternatives are chaotic. This is how elite survival strategies recruit compliance without force. They do not threaten starvation. They offer insulation from it on carefully managed terms. The human cost of Biltmore was not visible suffering. It was constrained choice. Workers were not chained. They were anchored. And anchoring has consequences. When your housing depends on your employer, dissent becomes dangerous. When your food is sourced through the same system that pays you, resistance becomes risky. When your social world exists within a controlled perimeter, imagination itself narrows. The estate did not need overt repression. It needed alignment. This alignment allowed Biltmore to function as a private city without public accountability. Decisions flowed downward. Rules were enforced quietly. Conflicts were handled internally. The estate's needs always took precedence over individual disruption. This is the moral inversion at the heart of elite resilience. Protection for the few is built on predictability from the many, and predictability requires pressure. What makes this uncomfortable is how modern it feels. Corporate campuses, company towns, gated communities with service populations living just outside visibility. The structure repeats because it works. Biltmore was an early, refined version of that logic. The Vanderbilt family could withdraw from national volatility because thousands of others absorbed its operational demands. The estate's autonomy was purchased with human routine. Every meal served, every hallway cleaned, every field managed, every machine maintained. This labor was not celebrated, it was normalized. Normalization is the most effective way to hide cost. Historical narratives often frame this as employment opportunity, and in a narrow sense, it was. But opportunity under constraint is not freedom. It is trade-off, and trade-offs distribute power unevenly. The estate created a stable environment for its core by compressing uncertainty into the lives of those who served it. Workers were protected from some risks, but exposed to others' dependency risk, eviction risk, reputation risk. If the system changed, they would feel it first, and systems always change. As the 20th century progressed, the social environment outside Biltmore evolved. Labor laws emerged. Expectations shifted. Workers began to see themselves not as grateful recipients of stability, but as participants entitled to rights. That transition creates friction in systems built on quiet compliance. Biltmore's internal order was not immune to the cultural pressures of the outside world. Even insulated systems leak. Ideas cross boundaries faster than supplies. Workers carried news. Newspapers circulated. Expectations followed. The estate's survival logic required not just labor, but loyalty. And loyalty erodes when asymmetry becomes too visible. The grandeur upstairs contrasted too sharply with the limits downstairs. This is the paradox elite planners often underestimate. Systems designed to manage risk also produce awareness. The very scale of Biltmore made inequality impossible to ignore for those maintaining it daily. Over time, proximity does not soften resentment. It sharpens it. The Vanderbilt family may have sought distance from national instability, but they created intimacy with inequality. And inequality is not passive. It accumulates meaning. The estate's villages, neat and controlled, were not neutral spaces. They were reminders of who owned the land, who set the rules, who could leave, and who could not. The human machinery behind Biltmore functioned precisely because it was invisible to those being protected. Visitors saw harmony. They did not see trade-offs. They did not see the quiet discipline required to keep the system smooth. Smooth systems are not frictionless. They are friction-contained. Contained friction does not disappear. It waits. This matters because elite survival strategies often assume labor stability as a constant. They plan for market volatility, political shifts, and public hostility, but they treat internal human systems as manageable variables. History suggests otherwise. When systems rely on suppressed voice rather than shared stake, stability becomes brittle. Biltmore did not collapse from revolt, but the pressures that shaped it never resolved. They transformed. Maintenance costs rose. Social expectations changed. The legitimacy of inherited wealth faced increasing scrutiny. The same human machinery that once made autonomy possible began to expose vulnerability. Workers were no longer silent participants in a private world. They became part of a national conversation about labor, rights, and fairness. The estate could not fully insulate itself from that shift. This is the unseen cost of elite insulation. The more you withdraw, the more your internal systems must compensate. And compensation grows expensive financially, socially, morally. By the early 20th century, the Vanderbilt family faced a paradox. The estate that once promised safety now demanded constant input. Labor expectations increased. Oversight intensified. The cost of maintaining quiet order rose year after year. Autonomy had a price, and that price was paid in people. This does not make the Vanderbilts uniquely villainous. It makes them historically typical. Power rarely asks who absorbs its risk. It asks only whether the risk is contained. Biltmore contained risk effectively for a time, but the human machinery beneath it was never static. It aged. It learned. It compared. And comparison is dangerous to systems built on hierarchy. Once workers see alternatives, the logic of dependency weakens. Once they see the estate as one option among many, rather than the only shelter, leverage shifts. This is why elite survival systems are always temporary solutions. They buy time, not permanence, and that time, once purchased, must be managed carefully, which leads to the next pressure point in the story. Because while Biltmore insulated the Vanderbilts from immediate chaos, it did not protect them from the slow accumulation of financial, political, and social backlash beyond the estate's borders. The question is not whether the system worked. It did. The question is, what happens when the world changes faster than a system designed to outlast it? Because when protection becomes burden, survival strategies begin to fracture. And that fracture is where collapse stops being theoretical and starts becoming personal. By the early 20th century, the danger facing the Vanderbilt family no longer looked like mobs or strikes pressing against the gates. It looked quieter than that, and far more difficult to escape. The survival logic embedded in Biltmore had assumed instability would arrive from the outside labor unrest, political agitation, public hostility toward concentrated wealth. Those threats were real, and they shaped every early decision. But what the estate could not fully account for was how pressure changes form once a system endures long enough. Collapse does not always arrive as violence. Sometimes it arrives as math. The very mechanisms that made Biltmore resilient in the 1890s became liabilities as the decades passed. Land that once insulated now demanded upkeep. Infrastructure that once provided independence required constant reinvestment. Labor systems that once ensured predictability now faced rising expectations and legal scrutiny. What had been a hedge against instability began to behave like a fixed cost in a world that no longer rewarded permanence. The first fracture came not from revolt, but from policy. The Progressive Era fundamentally altered the relationship between wealth and the state. Taxation shifted from episodic to structural. Inheritance, once an unquestioned privilege, became a target of reform. Antitrust sentiment hardened into law. Public rhetoric reframed enormous fortunes not as achievements, but as distortions. This was not sudden. It was cumulative. For families like the Vanderbilts, whose wealth had been built in an era of minimal restraint, the new political environment felt like slow encroachment. Each change was defensible in isolation. Together, they formed a new reality. The estate could survive unrest. It could not easily survive legitimacy loss. Biltmore had been designed to operate independently of markets and cities, but it could not detach from law. And law was changing in ways that made concentrated, visible wealth increasingly expensive to maintain. The estate's scale, once its greatest strength, now magnified every financial pressure. Taxes rose in proportion to land and assets. Maintenance costs escalated relentlessly. The workforce required higher wages and better conditions. Modern expectations did not stop at the gate. Autonomy is fragile when it depends on constant input. This is the contradiction at the heart of elite insulation strategies. Systems built to reduce exposure often increase overhead. Over time, overhead becomes a form of exposure. The Vanderbilts did not lose Biltmore in a dramatic collapse. They experienced something more corrosive: erosion. Each year demanded more resources to preserve the same level of control. The estate consumed capital rather than generating it. What had once functioned as a reserve of stability began to drain the very wealth it was meant to protect. This is the point where survival strategies invert. Protection becomes burden. Insurance becomes liability. The psychological shift this produces is profound. A system built to secure the future starts to threaten it instead. Decisions once made confidently now require justification. The estate's existence must be explained to governments, to the public, even to heirs. And explanation weakens authority. Biltmore's grandeur could no longer hide its inefficiency. In an age increasingly focused on productivity and return, a vast, self-contained estate looked less like foresight and more like excess. The narrative turned. What had once been admired as vision was recast as indulgence. This reputational shift mattered because legitimacy is a form of protection. When legitimacy erodes, defenses must work harder. And Biltmore's defenses were not designed to fight perception. They were designed to manage distance. But distance offers no refuge from taxation, no refuge from regulation, no refuge from changing norms. The estate could not withdraw from the national conversation about inequality, inheritance, and fairness. It was too large, too visible, too symbolic. Biltmore had become a monument to a worldview that was losing political ground. And monuments attract attention. As the 20th century progressed, the Vanderbilt fortune itself fragmented. Heirs inherited assets, but not always the discipline or context that had shaped their creation. Wealth that had once been centrally managed became dispersed. Obligations multiplied. The estate, fixed in place, could not adapt as quickly as the family structure around it. This is another overlooked vulnerability in elite planning. Succession. Systems, designed by one generation, often outlast the mindset that created them. Without continuous strategic alignment, they degrade into obligations rather than instruments. Biltmore required not just money, but belief. Belief in the necessity of autonomy, belief in long-term stewardship, belief that maintaining such a structure was worth the cost. As those beliefs weakened, so did the system. The estate's insulation strategy assumed a future where land remained the ultimate safeguard. But the 20th century introduced new forms of power and risk that land alone could not offset. Financial markets globalized, governments expanded, legal frameworks tightened, public scrutiny intensified. Collapse, in this context, did not mean destruction. It meant irrelevance. A system built to outlast instability now struggled to justify itself within a more regulated, more egalitarian, more scrutinized environment. The world did not burn, it reorganized, and reorganization is often more threatening to entrenched power than chaos. The Vanderbilts faced a choice that many elites eventually confront: adapt by compromising the original vision, or preserve the vision at increasing cost. Neither option leads to victory. Adaptation requires opening the system, selling land, allowing public access, relinquishing control. Preservation requires sacrifice, pouring resources into maintenance without corresponding return. Both paths signal retreat. Biltmore's survival thus became symbolic rather than strategic. It endured physically, but it no longer functioned as a private shield against national forces. The estate transitioned from a living system into a legacy object. Legacy objects are respected, but they are not feared, and fear is what keeps systems intact. What makes this phase of the story particularly unsettling is how familiar it feels. Modern elites face similar pressures, albeit in different forms: regulatory creep, public resentment, rising maintenance costs of insulation, whether physical, digital, or financial. The tools change, the pattern does not. Biltmore demonstrates that insulation strategies have expiration dates. They depend on a specific alignment of economic, political, and social conditions. When that alignment shifts, the system's strengths turn into weaknesses. The estate could survive labor unrest, but not labor reform. It could survive financial panic, but not structural taxation. It could survive resentment, but not delegitimization. This distinction matters because collapse, as experienced by elites, is rarely a single event. It is a sequence of constraints that slowly narrow options. Each year removes a degree of freedom. Each policy adds friction. Each cultural shift raises cost. Eventually, what remains is not collapse, but capture. The system still exists, but it no longer serves its original purpose. It must now serve the world it was built to avoid. This is the quiet failure of elite foresight. Planning assumes static adversaries. History introduces dynamic ones. Biltmore was built to survive a volatile America. It was not built to survive an America that redefined legitimacy itself. And that is the deeper lesson hidden behind its endurance. The estate did not fail because the Vanderbilts misjudged risk. They correctly anticipated instability. They misjudged direction. They prepared for chaos. What arrived instead was constraint. Which brings us to the final, unresolved tension. If Biltmore represents an early attempt by American elites to engineer survival through autonomy, and if that attempt ultimately transformed into burden rather than refuge, then the question is no longer historical. It is contemporary, because today's elites are building new systems of insulation, digital, financial, geographic, that mirror the logic of Biltmore in striking ways. The only difference is that they believe their systems are more adaptable. History suggests otherwise, and that is the discomfort waiting at the end of this story. Because when insulation fails quietly, collapse does not look like loss. It looks like endurance without power. And endurance without power is simply survival stripped of its advantage. Biltmore still stands. That fact alone invites a comforting conclusion that the strategy worked, that foresight triumphed, that wealth, when properly engineered, can outlast history. Visitors walk its halls today and feel solidity, stone, scale, continuity. It looks like proof. But survival is not the same as control, and endurance is not the same as victory. By the time Biltmore entered its second life as a preserved estate rather than a living system, it had already crossed an invisible line. It no longer functioned as insulation against national forces. It functioned as evidence of how those forces had won without ever needing to tear it down. This is the final inversion of the story. Biltmore survived America's transformation by surrendering the very privacy and autonomy it was built to protect. What began as a shield became a display. The estate did not fall to mobs or confiscation. It was not seized. It was not burned. Instead, it was absorbed culturally, economically, symbolically into the very public sphere it was designed to escape. That absorption is the quiet end state of most elite survival strategies. They do not collapse. They are repurposed. Biltmore's halls, once designed to limit access, now guide it. The estate generates revenue not through independence, but through exposure. Its continued existence depends on public interest, tourism, and institutional legitimacy. The system inverted completely. What protected the family now depends on the crowd. This is not irony. It is pattern. When private systems grow too large, too visible, too expensive to sustain without justification, they are eventually compelled to serve the public narrative. They must explain themselves, monetize themselves, open themselves, and once that happens, insulation ends. The Vanderbilts did not fail to anticipate instability. They failed to anticipate permanence becoming a liability. In the modern imagination, collapse is associated with destruction. But for entrenched systems, collapse more often arrives as integration. The system survives, but it no longer operates on its own terms. Biltmore is intact, but it is no longer sovereign. That distinction matters more than ruins ever could, because ruins signal defeat. Preservation signals negotiation, and negotiation means power has shifted. This is where the story turns from historical analysis into a mirror. The logic that shaped Biltmore did not disappear with the Gilded Age. It evolved. Today's equivalents do not look like castles. They look like networks, private infrastructure, redundant systems, parallel institutions, geographic dispersion, digital autonomy, offshore complexity. The language has changed, but the intent is familiar. Reduce dependency, control variables, buy time. Modern elites, like their predecessors, do not publicly predict collapse. They quietly prepare for scenarios in which existing systems no longer serve their interests. They build buffers, legal, financial, technological, that function the way land and isolation once did. The difference is speed. The world that Biltmore was built for moved slowly. Law changed over decades. Culture shifted across generations. Today, legitimacy can evaporate in years, sometimes months. Regulation arrives faster. Scrutiny is constant. Visibility is unavoidable, which raises an uncomfortable question. If Biltmore's strategy ultimately failed, not because it was poorly designed, but because the world changed faster than it could adapt, what does that imply for systems being built today? Contemporary insulation strategies assume flexibility. Algorithms can be rewritten, capital can be relocated, identities can be layered, but flexibility does not guarantee immunity. It often increases complexity, and complexity introduces new forms of fragility. Every layer added to protect power creates another surface exposed to pressure. Biltmore's builders believed land was permanence. They were correct for a time, but permanence eventually attracts attention, regulation, and reinterpretation. What cannot move becomes accountable. Modern systems attempt to solve that problem by staying mobile, but mobility creates dependence on abstract structures, law, data, energy, trust that are even harder to control than land. This is the recurring blind spot in elite planning. Each generation assumes it has solved the vulnerabilities of the last. History suggests it has merely exchanged them. Biltmore teaches us that survival strategies do not fail all at once. They succeed long enough to become visible, and visibility changes everything. Once a system is seen not as protection, but as separation, it invites moral scrutiny. Once it invites scrutiny, it invites reform. Once reform begins, autonomy erodes. That sequence does not require collapse. It requires consensus. This is why the final phase of elite survival is rarely dramatic. It is administrative, legal, cultural, quiet. Biltmore did not lose to chaos. It lost to normalization. Its existence was redefined, its meaning reassigned, its role transformed from private refuge to public artifact. The estate still exists, but the logic that created it no longer does. That is the most unsettling outcome of all, because it suggests that the true risk is not losing assets but losing narrative control. The Vanderbilts once controlled land, labor, and infrastructure. They could not control how future generations would interpret those things. Meaning escaped ownership, and meaning determines legitimacy. Today's elites face the same dilemma. No system, however advanced, can permanently insulate against reinterpretation. What is seen as prudent preparation in one era can be framed as hoarding, avoidance, or inequity in another. And when that reframing occurs, the system must either open itself or justify itself. Both options weaken it. This brings us back to the present not as comparison, but as continuation. Biltmore was built in a moment when American confidence masked deep instability. It was a hedge against volatility, not a rejection of the nation itself, but its ultimate fate reveals a deeper truth. Systems designed to escape the future often end up shaped by it instead. The estate survived, but not on its own terms. That is the outcome most survival strategies quietly produce, which leaves a final question that cannot be answered by architecture, wealth, or foresight alone. If the most carefully engineered refuge of its time ultimately had to surrender autonomy to survive, what makes today's systems different? And more importantly, when future generations walk through the structures being built right now, will they see foresight or evidence of a fear that could not outlast the world it was trying to avoid? If you want more investigations like this, stories that don't end neatly, and questions that refuse to stay in the past, subscribe.